Welcome everybody. So welcome everybody. I'm happy that we can continue with our seminars in the Sala de Graus again after these almost 2 years. So I'm happy that you are here. And for the ones that are new in this seminar, we are the Institute of Aquatic Ecology, and we organize a monthly seminar on a regular basis. And our researchers in our institute present their results. We also invite speakers from other institutes and centers from very different topics. So today, I would like to present Joan Pere Casas Ruiz. He's Juan de la Cierva Posto in the research group of Ecology of Inland Waters. And I hope that this presentation will be, I guess, very interesting. So thank you very much for coming.
So thank you, Frederick, for the introduction. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here giving this talk, and especially that is face-to-face, because I've been missing this a lot. I actually said no to an invitation to give a seminar a while ago because I was waiting for this moment, so we can face-to-face. Okay, so we're here now, and I'm going to show you some of the work I did during my postdoc in Canada. And so we're going to talk about carbon, which is basically my research field, in boreal aquatic networks. Okay, but before that, I would like to give you a very brief overview of my research background, which basically goes back to this figure. This is the global carbon cycle, a very simplified scheme from the IPCC report in 2013. And here we can see the main compartments of the Earth, the different stocks of carbon, and the exchange with the atmosphere between these different compartments, right? Now, in the early 2000s, we used to believe that inland waters were just passive pipes of carbon. So they were just transporting terrestrial carbon through rivers to the ocean. But after a few years of intense research, we realized that not at all. They are actually very active in terms of processing carbon. So they do transport carbon, but during transport, this carbon is processed a lot. And some of it can be trapped in sediments of lakes and reservoirs, for instance, and some of it can be mineralized and emitted back to the atmosphere, offsetting actually some of the sinks that we have in forests and wetlands, etc. And this is understanding a bit these vertical and horizontal dimensions of inland waters in terms of carbon. It's what has been motivating my research from the beginning, because I did my undergrad and master's degree or the thesis, let's say, based on, well, focusing on the burial of carbon in reservoirs. Then during my PhD, I worked on the controls of dissolved organic matter in rivers. So basically trying to understand the origin and the processing of this dissolved organic matter, and also paying particular attention to how DOM, dissolved organic matter, how it varies across space and time and in rivers. So from headwaters to the ocean, but also from drought events to storms. And then I moved to Canada. So I went to Montreal. I joined the group of Older Giorgio in Universitat de Quebec in Montreal. I spent 2 years and a half there, and there I focused a bit more on these aspects, on the emissions of inland waters, on the carbon emissions of inland waters in boreal networks. And while I was there, I got involved in several projects that they had there ongoing, and I had the chance to fly over this landscape many times. And something that really amazed me is the diversity of shapes of lakes that we can find there. Okay, so there are some lakes that are like perfectly rounded, some lakes that are elongated, right? A lot of different shapes, and particularly these ones that I like a lot. We call this ring-shaped lakes. Okay, in this case, this one is my favorite, Lake Manikugan, and this was originated by the impact of a meteorite. And it's actually not unique because we can find a similar one in Sweden. So it's actually a common, well, not very common, but it's not rare at all to find this kind of shapes also in Scandinavia, right? So across the boreal biome, we have all these different types of lakes based on size and shape. And this caught my attention, and I wondered whether this was relevant in terms of carbon, right? If like basically does the size and the shape matters in terms of the carbon biogeochemistry of these systems? And this is basically what the question I had there, right? So does the size and shape influences how much carbon we're going to find in these lakes? And to start with, we had a look at basically lake geography. So how are these lakes distributed and what are their size, etc. And I got interested in different lake geography facts, like for instance that there is a clearly uneven distribution of lakes across the globe, right? Some areas have no lake at all. Some others are very, very rich, mostly in the northern regions, in the boreal biome. There's the highest density of lakes, particularly in the Canadian Shield here. Also the size distribution of lakes, okay? So most of them are very small. There are millions of small lakes, but only a few that are large, right? This figure is from Downing et al., and it shows the frequency of different lake classes, okay? You can see that the ones that dominate are clearly the smallest ones, and then there's like a tendency to go down as we increase the size of the lake. And this is an example of a size distribution of lakes in a common lake district that you can find. So it's, I don't know if you can see it from there, but it's full of small lakes, like hundreds of small lakes, and then some of them that are very large, right? So usually small lakes dominate. And the size of the lakes is actually linked to their shape, okay? This is data from Quebec that I collected myself, and here we can find the lake area in the x-axis of the 3 panels, and then different lake morphometry metrics. And what we found was that, so larger lakes, they tend to be more fractal, so their shape is more fractal, okay? Also, larger lakes tend to be more elongated, as opposed to small lakes that are more circular. And also the larger lakes have a higher area to depth ratio. So they look a bit more like a plate, while the small lakes look more like a bowl or a canyon line shape, okay? So once we had an idea a bit of this distribution of lakes, etc., we can go back to our question, which is basically if the size and especially the shape of the lake matters in terms of the carbon biogeochemistry. The way we tackled this question was to take advantage of an extensive data set that my colleagues had previously collected while I arrived there. And it's basically data of around 300 lakes distributed across different regions in Quebec. And we had data on dissolved organic carbon concentrations and also carbon dioxide and methane concentrations of the surface water of these lakes. And then what we did was for each of these lakes, we calculated several morphometry metrics, so the area, no explanation needed, then the shoreline complexity, right, so to capture whether the contour of the lake was smooth or fractal, right, we would say that this has a more complex shoreline. This is important because it means more contact with the terrestrial environment, and therefore perhaps more inputs of carbon dioxide, etc., from soil, so as you see. Also the circularity, right, from elongated lakes to more circular ones. This is important sometimes in terms of the effect of wind on the lake. So these ones have a larger fetch than this one, right? So that for the same wind speed, we could have more turbulence in the lake, in this kind of lakes. Well, also the depth of the lake and the dynamic ratio, right? The dynamic ratio is, again, if they look a bit more like a bowl or like a plate. And then we used elastic net models to test whether these variables were important to explain how much carbon dioxide, DOC, or methane we find in a lake. On top of these variables, we also added some watershed or climatic and environmental factors, because the lakes that we have, they come from very different regions, different latitudes, so sometimes the concentrations that we find in the lake, it's just based on different terrestrial productivity in the watershed, etc. So we also incorporated the first axis of an environmental PCA. So we take into account regional differences. And this is what we found. So this figure basically summarizes the three models that we did, one model for CO2, methane, and DOC. And here we have our explanatory variables, which are the lake morphometry metrics. And then the size of the symbol indicates the coefficients of the model, and the color indicates whether the influence was positive or negative. And we found that yes, indeed, the size and the shape, they do influence the concentration of these carbon species. For example, the size, we found a similar effect for all of them. So smaller lakes tend to have higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and VOC. This is actually not new. This has been observed before in the literature, and it's related to gas exchange because larger lakes tend to have a higher turbulence. But we also found that the shape of the lake also matters. For example, in the case of CO2, the shoreline complexity is positively related to the concentration. So lakes that are more fractal are more in contact with terrestrial ecosystems that inject CO2 into the lake. So there's a tendency to increase the CO2 if you have a more complex shoreline, right? A more fractal shape. For methane, for example, we found that it was linked to virtually every metric we tested. And this is something that we actually expected because methane is influenced by inputs from soils, but also from in-lake processes, especially related to the sediment. And we can see, for example, the dynamic ratio. If you remember, high dynamic ratio means that the lake is a bit more like a plate. And this means that you have then a higher influence of sediment than if your lake is more like a bowl, right? So we found that higher influence of sediments, you tend to have more methane in your lake. And the same for DOC, right? We found also similar relationship with dynamic ratio, which is probably related to the release of DOC from the sediments. So yeah, indeed, the size and the morphometry are related to how much carbon these lakes have. And why is this important? Well, because the shape and the size of lake is not random across the landscape, right? This is a map. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's fine. This is a map that a colleague of mine, Julia Jacobson, produced. And this shows the distribution of different lake morphotypes. Okay? Lake morphotypes meaning that are lakes with different combinations of size, shoreline complexity, and this vertical profile, right? And you can see that it's not random at all. There are some regions that are dominated by some specific types of lakes, right? What this means is that even though we can have regional differences in the concentrations across lakes, blah blah blah, this I like to call it the morphogeography of lakes. It imposes a certain degree of special structure in the carbon concentrations of these lakes, right? So if the shape of the lake matters and there are some patterns in the shapes of lakes, this already imprints a structure in the concentrations of DOC, of PCO2, carbon dioxide, and methane that we're going to find in our landscape. Another outcome that we can get out of this exercise is that by accounting for the size and shape of lakes, we can improve predictive models of carbon concentrations in lakes, right? So this is for the same data set. We compared three different models with different structures, okay? A model that only has climate and line cover data to predict our concentrations in the lake, a model that has climate and line cover plus lake area, and a model that has climate and line cover, lake area, and also the shape of the lake. And on the y-axis, we can find the R-square of these different models. And we can see that by including the lake area and also including the shape, we can really improve our prediction of how much carbon we will find in the water of these lakes across the lake. And this can be used then for improve upscaling methods. And this is what we need actually. In a second stage, this was actually my main goal when I arrived to Quebec, was to quantify how much carbon was being emitted from aquatic networks in Quebec. So not only streams, not only rivers or lakes, but the whole network, right? And so to do that, and we wanted also to take into account these ecosystem individual properties like the size and shape of lakes, also the size and position of streams along the water continuum, etc. And this is what we try. We try to make like a very integrative framework. I'm not going to go into details because I'm sure you cannot read anything back from there, right? But we basically combined, we did some GIS analysis to get the stream networks and the lake polygons for our landscape. We did this not for whole Quebec. We selected some watersheds, okay? And for each of these watersheds, we derived, so the Aquatic network with GIS analysis. And then we used empirical models, some were ours, some were derived from the literature, to predict, for example, the concentration of CO2 in streams, the same for methane. This was based on the productivity of terrestrial ecosystems and the position of the stream along the continuum, etc. Then we can combine these with estimates of gas exchange coefficients, which we derived from the channel of the river, from the slope of the river channel, and water velocity, right? And then we can combine the data and we get how much a water parcel of stream is emitting to the atmosphere. We can do the same for lakes. We derived the concentrations of CO2 and methane in lakes from the size, from the shape, and from watershed characteristics. We also calculated the gas exchange coefficient derived from the wind and the size of the lake, and we can get our diffusion emissions from lakes. On top of that, lakes, they also emit methane through bubbles that are formed in the sediment, and they are suddenly released to the atmosphere. So we also accounted for this based on temperature in the sediment and total phosphorus concentrations. What else? On top of that, we added the climatic layer. Okay, we accounted for the ice period, because when there's snow and ice on top of these lakes, we assume that there is no carbon emissions. Although when the ice off, so when the ice breaks, there's actually like a hotspot of emission. So we also accounted for that. And once we had all these, we got these kind of maps. So for each of these watersheds, we had our stream and lake networks with different values of emission for each water parcel, okay? And then we can combine all these emissions to get our, let's say, total network aquatic carbon emissions. This is what we were trying to get here. And we got these numbers. So they were around 11 to 38 grams of carbon per square meter of watershed per year. This was a bit unexpected for us because we expected a bit more variability, given that we had very different regions across Quebec. But in terms of magnitude, this is very interesting because it's comparable to other components of the boreal carbon budget. For example, these numbers are in the same magnitude to the long-term carbon accumulation in soils, or the NEP of forest and wetlands, or the direct carbon emissions from forest fires, right? So we need to really account for these total aquatic carbon emissions, because they have the potential to offset some of these terrestrial sinks. So if we don't account for them, numbers, they are not going to match in carbon budgets, right? And therefore, we need to account for this, and we need to understand how this number varies across the landscape. So why sometimes we have higher total aquatic carbon emissions, and why sometimes we have very low total aquatic emissions. We explored some potential drivers, and what we found was that the slope of the landscape was let's say, the overarching predictor, because it integrates a lot of drivers. So for example, if we split between lakes and streams, we can see how the lake carbon emissions decrease exponentially with the average slope of the watershed. And this is actually because in flat areas, so in this region, we have very large and shallow lakes, and they emit a lot just because there's a lot of water, like of water surface. While in the case of streams, we saw the opposite pattern. So as we increase the slope of our landscape, we have higher fluvial emissions. And this is basically because we have steeper channels with a lot of turbulence, and this emits more carbon, right? So what happens when we combine these? That we have this U-shaped pattern of total aquatic carbon emissions across this slope gradient. What we can find here is then that one should expect the highest aquatic carbon emissions at both ends of the slope spectrum. But this is not exactly the same. The origin of these emissions can vary, right? If you are here, you're going to have very high aquatic emissions, but they are going to mostly come from rivers because you have these steep channels. While if you are in very flat areas, you're going to still get high carbon emissions, but they are going to come from lakes. So they have a completely different emission. And well, this basically means that one can have a look at the map of the average slope of different regions in Quebec, and you can already guess a bit how much your aquatic network in these areas is going to emit, right? So for example, here we have very steep areas, and I would expect high emissions coming especially from streams, right? While here in these blue areas, I would expect high emissions from lakes. That could be even actually at the same level than these ones that are mostly from streams, right? So just by using watershed slope, which is more like a landscape property, it doesn't not necessarily an aquatic property, we can get already an idea of how our network will contribute to the whole landscape carbon budget. Yeah, so based on these data, we can get basically 3 take-home messages. I would say it's basically that the size and the shape, they do matter, okay? So we can actually not predict, but they do influence the concentrations of the different carbon species in lakes. Second, that this morphogeography of lakes imposes a certain degree of spatial structure, okay, in the carbon concentrations in lakes. And finally, that a simple landscape property such as the slope of the landscape can help us predict how much our aquatic network is going to emit. And this is actually because it integrates information about the configuration of the aquatic network. So areas that are flat, they tend to have larger lakes and low turbulence in streams, while areas that are much steeper, they contain small lakes that are more like deep and with very steep slopes for streams, right? So it's like an overarching integrator of the function, no, not the function, but the configuration of aquatic networks. And yeah, so I was saying before that we try to incorporate a bit everything or as much as I could to these total aquatic carbon emissions, streams, rivers, lakes, evolution in lakes, the ice period, blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of things that we could use also to improve this. And what we are doing right now, actually, to try to improve these numbers, is to incorporate something that I like a lot, which are river points. Because in Quebec, in the last, let's say, 100 years, there's been a rise in the population density of beavers, basically because we stopped trading the leather. And so they are replacing a lot of the river network by beaver habitats, by beaver dams. Yeah. And this could have an impact on our aquatic emissions because they are basically increasing the water residence time, right? And this could induce a higher organic matter degradation and therefore the generation of carbon dioxide and methane that is going to be emitted. And also because we've seen that if we compare the beaver habitats with the river that was before there, they emit a much higher ratio of methane to CO2. And this is important because methane, it's a much more, it has a much higher global warming potential. So for the same amount of carbon, it's worse if we emit methane because it's going to stay longer in the atmosphere and has much more greenhouse. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
So if you have any questions.
Okay, I imagine that your lakes are very, very big. So,
Some of them.
no, I mean these Canadian lakes, no? And do you think this relationship with shape and morphometric variables are also applicable for the small ponds or other water bodies?
Yeah, I have to say that we discarded the small ponds that I think we like.
Okay.
We did that because when in the GIS analysis we did not have the tools to really characterize them because mean, we tried, but the polygons were, I mean, we were comparing our polygons with the satellite images, and it was like, yeah, I think we can use this. So the shape was totally off, the size was totally off. So we decided that at least for this point, we could not do it. That said, I would say probably not. Because you're right, I mean, this is based on data of deep lakes. I mean, we have shallow lakes, like 1 meter, we have some of them, but most of them are like 10, 15, 20 meters. I wouldn't say we can extrapolate these to super shallow ones. But this is just another level to add, another layer to add to these aquatic calculations. After deeper ponds, we will.
I have a question also. Do you think that this would be very different in another biome?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Because this is also highly dependent on how the lakes were created, for instance. So in this case, most of them come, so the shape of the lakes or the origin of the lakes comes either from the impact of meteorites, but mostly from the retreat of ice during the last glacial periods. And the combination of the ice and different geologies and slopes, this is what carved these different shapes. It's a completely different story in temperate systems that were never glaciated. Well, they were, but not in the last glaciation, etc. So I would not try to apply this simple, for instance, this relationship with average watershed slope. I would not try to extrapolate it to different biomes. Try that. And also, I would say that if there's permafrost, it could be also a bit different. So this was, we thought about this only for the landscapes that are similar to this. So basically, boreal shield in Canada, Scandinavia, Russia.
So the anthropogenic impact is very low here.
Yeah. I mean, I considered land use in the models, and I mean, urban land use is always like 0.00, and same for agriculture. There's some agriculture close to the rivers and mountains, but well, you can see this. I mean, we had to fly over these because there's no roads, so you can imagine.
If you analyze seasonality, did you find some seasonal differences in the?
I don't have the data to do that because, well, some of these lakes freeze. It's impossible to get there by hydrogen or anything, and so all the data comes from the summer season, growing season.
One single summer.
Yeah, we have from late spring to early autumn, but we didn't have room to play and the seasonality. But of course, there's a lot because we've seen, we saw that there's a climatic signature, so with different temperatures we get different concentrations, and the same with the ice dynamics, for sure. But we could not test this. One of the limitations of the system that you cannot get there. Well, you can get there if you're studying 1 or 2 lakes, but if you want to get 300, it's very difficult.
We have a question in the chat. Is from Rafa Marcel. He said, I guess it is better to use the chat. So he wrote, the point is that vast regions like Quebec probably harbor limited geological and human impact variability, so drivers potentially related to the landscape have a measurable effect. What about a place like Europe, where the landscape is a diverse puzzle? Do you think it would also work there?
No, it's a bit related to Anna's question. I don't think we can extrapolate this. I mean, of course, for instance, in steeper landscapes, also in Europe, we would have higher fluvial emissions probably, but we cannot use just a single driver like, average slope in systems that are completely altered. Also, he was talking, I guess, about changing hill slopes and etc. That then it's going to ruin this signature of landscape composition, right? because we are altering it. So no, Rafa, I don't think we can extrapolate this. It's not feasible. We would need to add much many drivers in here.
There's another question from Susana Bernal. Joan, this was a great talk. Congratulations. How much area of the total landscape is occupied by the fluvial network? By how much they would actually offset the terrestrial carbon sink in this case?
So the percent area occupied by streams, I think it's around 4% perhaps. And I don't really remember, but these numbers that I showed here, these are grams of, she can see my these are grams of carbon per square meter of watershed. So this is directly comparable to the terrestrial carbon sink, right? So let's say in general, streams are emitting around 5 grams of carbon per square meter of watershed per year. And this would be equivalent, for instance, to direct carbon emission from fires, also to the NEP, the low range of NEP in Myers, and also long-term carbon accumulation in soil. So, yeah, I mean, of course, they are not going to offset all the whole terrestrial carbon sink, but in some places, especially in steeper landscapes, they can really play a role in the carbon budget.
I have a question. So is there any relationship between the carbon emissions and the type of organic carbon? So greenhouses run organic carbon or other sources?
Yeah. I mean, this is, we didn't have the data at all to test this kind of stuff. But yeah, of course, I mean, depending on the availability or the degradability of your carbon, you're going to get more mineralization of this carbon, and so you're going to get more emissions, or at least more carbon dioxide in your water. But yeah, trying to predict the composition of the OM at the regional or global scale, whatever it is, that would be amazing, but it's very difficult to. But for sure, this plays a role.
Okay. More questions?
The trophic levels of the lakes was similar or
It was pretty similar. Yeah.
quite a
Yeah,
little?
yeah. Most of them. Practically all of them. We have nutrient data that here, and I don't have the numbers in my head. But yeah, I mean, they are like pretty far from every possible human activity, and there is low natural input of nutrients. So yeah, most of them are very eutrophic. We don't have a big range in trophic level to test effect.
I have another question. So, it's a curiosity. So, do you know why are the lakes more frequent in the north hemisphere than in the south?
No, these are honestly, I don't know.
Because you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, true. But no, honestly, I don't know. Something to check.
And I've got another question. You said that in Europe it would be difficult, of course, to apply this, but it would be an option to try to find a similar product and then to see how much of the CO2 emissions is related to the slope or any geographical, just to take this.
Yeah.
To
So
see how much is due to the, since this is kind of a control side or something like this, or not, so it is.
yeah, I don't know because so per se, I mean, if you take Europe, I don't know, like some millennia ago without any human impact, I would say that I would expect differences already, just because the landscape is different and because the aquatic systems were created in a different way, etc. So I don't think we could use it as a control or something. But it doesn't mean we cannot try. So what I would say is we cannot predict emissions in Europe based on the slope using that relationship. But this can be applied everywhere. So we can get our total aquatic emissions for, let's say, Europe, and then explore the potential drivers in Europe. Right? This could be out there for sure. But no, this is important. I mean, we're not trying to say that this can be applied everywhere because for sure.
Rafa Marcel just said this, I think it's related to the last question. There is more land abandoned during glacial periods, I guess. I think it's
Related to why there are more lakes in the north, you mean?
In the north.
I mean in the sense that we have also drained a lot of.
in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
More questions?
What, but they're very related to the one, because we're exploring carbon emissions. I'm wondering, what about temporality? When because in the Mediterranean, a lot of water bodies dries during the summer, and so I guess there is more mineralization. So maybe the outputs
Yes.
are bigger. Do you know some study that has already checked this, the amount of carbon that they're emitting?
Yeah. Actually, Rafa Merced,
Yeah.
he's leading a huge task on this direction. Because I mean, when they dry, they emit a lot of carbon.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of degradation, and also because there's no water that can act as a lead, right? So everything is outcast. But I don't know of any study that have tried to do this at the, let's say, regional scale,
Yeah.
to incorporate this
Qualification
into.
the amount of, like.
I'm not sure. Maybe Rafa, see, very active. Maybe he's aware of some study or some people trying to do it. Maybe he's. But not that I know of. But it's also because it's very difficult to model and predict the drying of these systems.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we can do it in some specific
And
places.
localize
But
it in the landscape. Satellite images to get the position and the shape of
absolutely.
temporary.
Absolutely. I mean, we could use like a simplified framework. It doesn't have to be based on the size and shape, but only trying to predict the expansion and contraction of the network. I mean, I've seen some examples in single watersheds, but extrapolating these to large areas is not easy. But there's a lot of people actually working on this because dry systems now it's for many reasons, not only for carbon, also for fish dynamics. And so there's a lot of people working on it.
More questions? Okay, then thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for connecting to the seminar. Okay, bye.
Next week there's another one. It's a bit tricky, but spatial decision support tools for marine spatial planning. And it's going to be run by Dr. Stefano Menegon and Dr. Daniel De Pellegrin from Seahouse. It's the 5th segment. No, porque ya están dando.
Thank you.